Alrighty, welcome to Roundtable Decision. I'm your host, Wyatt Birkenoff, and for today we have Anavultus, who is also a philosopher and YouTube streamer slash video maker as well. And as you notice on my channel, I have philosophy as the banner under Roundtable Decision. And when I was originally making the project, I wanted to do a lot more philosophical type of videos. And in the past, I've done a few, but I haven't done as many as I would like. So I thought a good way to kind of start it off would to have a live stream with another philosophical type of person, and in this case, Anavultus, and to just kind of discuss our ideas and in general about philosophy. And I'll have Anavultus introduce himself to you, as maybe not all of you know who he is. Well, thank you. And so I thought before we kind of get into deep dots, I guess you would call them, is just about like who is your favorite philosopher or maybe favorite idea of a philosopher, and just kind of why that is. That makes some sense after the explanation. I think if you just said that up front, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I thought I would kind of discuss my favorite one before we kind of move on from this. I was thinking, although it may sound a little basic, and I have put some thought into it as well, I just keep coming back to mainly the idea, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I like all his ideas. I think he's fully my favorite philosopher if I were to think about it more. Uh, like before this, we talked about Maslow, and I like Maslow's ideas, but I wouldn't necessarily say he's my favorite, even though he might have my favorite idea. But going back to kind of what I was originally saying, the one what I keep coming back to within just philosophy and what I kind of use in my everyday life in a lot of different ways is like the Socratic method. and just simply asking why to kind of understand something more than just the baseline level. Because in general, I've always been the type of person, I wouldn't say I would go into like rabbit holes and like super deep thought into everything, but I would go into deep thought more than everybody else, even when it came to like simple things. And so I think just asking why kind of brings you to more outcomes than you originally thought there might be. So I think I would say that the Socratic method is maybe one of my favorite ideas, even though if I put more thought into it, I might come up with something different, but that's kind of what I've been leaning towards now. So more about Plato than Socrates, yeah. Yeah, because I'm not so much interested in like the way Socrates did it and more in the way Plato did it. Although that's why I was kind of saying that don't go into too deep into like what Plato was doing or did in his writings, but I try to at least understand something more than just the base level or just the entry of some dot. Yep. And I was thinking of like an example I could use for this, and obviously there's like the superstitial, I guess you would say, examples of like when they ask you to do something, they being my parents, like take out the trash. I tried to think like why do I need to take out the trash, but not in the way of like going against the parents, but more like what does this serve? And obviously you could say, well, it serves to better the environment through recycling in the case of recycle, or you could kind of go through that. But I think a lot of people and myself before I kind of really thought about philosophy was more thought about things and like why do I have to do this more than things of why is it being done or why do we need to do it, but not in the way of going against somebody, if that makes sense as well. Yeah, exactly. Let's see. Ron was saying that he could only hear me. Can you hear Anavultus that time, Ron? I noticed that the connection dropped a little bit, so it may have been because of that. But want to make sure that we're not streaming and can't hear half of the people. So we'll see if he pops up there again and see if he could hear you that time. But kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about next was I've listened to several of your videos and like your debate with Matt Christensen, even though it was more of a discussion. But I just call it debate just for the dramatic side to right, yeah. Because debates do have very specific rules and other things. But you bring up the idea that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but basically that authority makes up rules and authority is like how we are structured. So if you could just explain that a little bit more.
Made rules, but never enforced the rules, never punished anyone for breaking the rules. There were no consequences for not following the rules. People that followed the rules didn't have any advantage over anyone that didn't follow the rules. Then you end up in a situation where the rules might as well not exist. And I'm saying that not in the sense that that's why people follow the rules, which is a different question, because I think love also has a role to play in why people follow rules and in the importance of following rules. But in an example of the real world on whether rules are relevant to actions and whether rules form a component of justice, I think the enforcement of it is essential. And that's why I say that natural rights advocates talk a lot about how rules are derived from nature, but when we actually talk about how those are enforced in a society, what you require is an authority, which means even if you try to say that nature is where you're getting it from, what you're actually doing is you're taking that and using that as a rationalization for your actual authority that then enforces it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that when you were discussing with Matt Christensen, he would tend to. I don't really go with what you were saying in the sense that I don't think you really wanted to get involved as much as what you were trying to show. So he was kind of missing your examples, I guess is the easiest way to put it. And I think I kind of agree in general with that stance. I don't really see anything against it because I do think authority does shape how we live and rules that get made under it. Because there's always an example of authority, even if it's just as simple as parents over their kids, are like the example of empires such as like the Roman Empire in structure and how things get made. So I do think that I tend to agree that authority does mean more than what people generally think of it as meaning.
And the idea here is that without authority, immorality becomes something that is not really relevant. Because you could say that authority does not necessarily make morality relevant. However, you can say that that something that is not really definable in a general sense, because there's no real disadvantage to being a moral if there's no authority.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if I have any counter argument against it right now, because I have thought about what you have said, and it's hard for me to really form thoughts against it, because I do think that in general I agree with your stance, but I don't know if I generally understand it fully yet as well. And I think that maybe if I listen to more of your videos or read your book, that I'll be able to grasp more of exactly what you're saying. But uh, like I said before, I think in general I do agree with the stance you have for it. But I don't know if I necessarily understand it as of yet.
That I understand that sometimes the way I say things can be arcane, and I think that's a complaint someone had in one of the comments on my discussion with Matt Christensen, was that I was going too deep, and I was not only missing the forest for the trees, but missing everything for the blades of grass. But I understand that some people might have difficulty.
Yeah, understanding it fully. And I think that although okay, I'll put it this way. I think a lot of famous philosophers and philosopher ideas that get talked about in media or in general what people know are kind of philosophy that is a little easier to understand, and that's just because it's better to grasp and you kind of feel accomplished when you fully get something. But I think a lot of philosophy that gets not talked about enough is philosophy that takes a little bit longer to understand. And I think that that's kind of what your idea is. Because I don't know if like how Matt Christensen and you might have been going too deep in your examples, but a lot of times examples are kind of what provide the situation or the outline to understand something. So
I think another aspect of the things I say is that I don't focus on validating people. I don't focus on saying things that make people happy. I'm trying to be descriptive of what I see reality as being. And that's very different from trying to validate people, which is one thing that a lot of modern philosophers particularly like to focus on.
yeah, because there's a lot of philosophy of like trying to make someone feel good about themselves, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I do think that, especially with like participation trophies as an example, I think about in that case, although it may not be so much a philosophical idea and more of a psychology type of idea, it disvalues everybody by giving everyone a participation trophy besides the people that deserve like the game ball, for example. Because I can remember when I played baseball and we had the game balls at that point, and I got one in like the first game, and I was very happy about that. But then I remember later I played soccer, I believe it was, and the whole team got like a participation trophy, and we were really bad at soccer as the team. But that's kind of the side point. But I just remember the way I felt wasn't really happy. It was more just, okay, I don't really see this as being anything special. So it kind of takes away that value and that point you had by giving everybody something instead of just someone something. And I think in general, philosophers as of late are trying to get more of like you are you type of attitude, or you as a group are better if you all do something, more than just, hey, if you think about this or if you do this, it's better because you're the one what thought about it, I guess is the best way to put that.
Well, if you think about the implication of what I'm saying, what are the political implications of saying that authority is the source of all justice. The implication is that human rights are not qualities of humans. The implication is that human rights come from outside of humans, and not simply from outside of humans, but from that human rights are artifices, that human rights are tools that are created by people in power. And that's something that a lot of people are very uncomfortable with, the idea, but I think it's a true idea. I think it's observable in the world, in how things change, in how governments are run, and I would say it's consistent with my theological views, which is one thing that is always very important is your root paradigm, what you see the world as being. What is the cosmos? What is the universe? Does it have a purpose? Where does it come from? All of that has a huge impact on what is allowable in the realm of philosophy, in the sense that, let's say, a Christian is not going to be consistent and be a nihilist, for example. A Christian cannot be consistently a nihilist. And that's just an example I'm making. So what I'm saying is there needs to be a consistency in various viewpoints. And when you have that emphasis, that limits the directions you can go, because what that means is that you have a reality that is something that is independent of your desires and your perception, and you take that and you have to shape your ideas to that, instead of trying to shape reality to your ideals.
Yeah, I kind of, yeah. So like, I think I understand what you're saying in that sense. Like, okay, so for Christianity, because you're a Christian and I'm a Christian as well, in general, you're supposed to have more of like an optimistic view, and in general, you're supposed to be more happy, in quotations. I remember like hearing that on like daycares with it or in other things, because you're supposed to kind of share God's word and whatever else you might want to call that. But in general, I remember like in high school, you could be pessimistic, and although being pessimistic and Christian at the same time doesn't really make much sense. And I have actually thought about that before, because in general, the more I believed in my religion, in general, I would say the more happier I was. And the more I kind of got away from it or pursued other things more, the less happy I was. And I don't know if that's necessarily always like 100% true, but I do say that more in general, it was true when I actually like believed in something or pursued it a little bit more through religion. I was more happier as a person, more than if I tried to do something else to kind of fill in the gap. And I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying in what you were talking about, but it's kind of what I was thinking from what you were saying.
Well, I think one thing that's important to note is that while I do have this optimism, because I am a Christian, that I do have these hopes, that to get to those hopes, I have to throw away ideas that are contrary to those hopes, in the sense that if my hope comes from a particular point, I can't say that my hope also comes from a different point, because that would be dishonest. So, for example, the idea of human happiness, in the sense that I believe that happiness is something that to the fullest can be experienced through the grace of God. Okay? The implication, however, of me following God is, however, that God is more important than I am, which means that if it made me deeply unhappy to follow God, that would still be better than not following God and being happy.
Right. And
Is that what I'm saying?
I think so, yeah.
There's priorities here. What I'm saying is that the idea, the popular idea that morality is following human flourishing or human happiness, that idea, an idea that to some extent Aristotle had expressed, although a lot of modern philosophers express it in that formulation, that idea is completely opposed to Christianity. The idea that human happiness and human flourishing is the highest virtue is completely opposed to Christian values.
Yeah. And I'll just ask Ron a quick question. You can hear Anavultus good then, right? I just want to make sure because I know he was saying to turn up the volume a little bit ago and I did that. So hopefully you're coming across crystal clear now. And I do think that I get what you're saying now. And this is slightly of a different type of question, but one I was thinking about also in what your examples were. But I kind of thought about this question throughout the week in preparation for this video as well. But I wrote the question in this way, but I put, do you see religion and philosophy as different or more of the same?
Well, I would say that we could say that religion encompasses more than philosophy, and philosophy encompasses more than religion. So there's a Venn diagram here to be made, and the overlap is what we call theology.
Right.
So theology is a category of philosophy and also a category of religion.
Yep.
So in that sense, I would say that it's important, and especially if you make positive claims about theological properties and theological events, then you come to a position where those become more important and they begin to affect the rest of your philosophical viewpoints. Because if you believe, as Christians do, that various things and that God makes commands and that God will hold people accountable to follow those commands and to know what he has revealed, then that means that that has a huge impact on how you live your daily life, how you formulate your ethics, how you build governments. And political philosophy is something that I'm very interested in, which is why I developed an ideology. But it has huge ramifications. So theology, even if your changes the whole paradigm of how someone approaches philosophy.
Yeah. Because I think, in my case, I would say that I think there's in parts where they are the same, to keep it like in very general type of way, and there are parts that So in the past, a lot of people thought that science and religion were against each other. Sorry? Go on.
Did you hear everything I said?
It cut out for a little bit towards the end.
Okay. At what point did it cut out?
It was cutting out towards when you were explaining the middle part of theology and kind of how it was the dot of it. I don't know if that's the best way of putting it, but
well, what I was saying is that theology has produces paradigms which affect the rest of philosophy. So even if you're not a religious person, it's important to understand theology to some extent, and therefore theology is very important in philosophy.
right. At first, I remember when I was going through my religious perspective, I didn't really understand what theology was until, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, to where I kind of think I understand exactly its purpose in religion. Because I kind of think of this question as like the previous question I kind of was mentioning before about science, because a lot of people in the past thought science and religion were against each other. And you had like the Catholic Church, for example, that thought and I might be saying this wrong, but the sun went around the moon, or not the sun, the earth went around, what is it? I knew I would forget it when I wanted to bring it up.
The earth was at the center of the solar system. That's what they believe.
Yeah, that's it. There you go. Anyway, and so when they had people go against it, they would put them in jail and do all sorts of things with it, because they wanted to keep the information to themselves and to keep the idea of being the center of the universe as the idea. And so taking that example and then using this question of if I see them as the same or different, I think in some parts I do see them as different, but as the like 75% of the same, I would say. And I think it's because of that, because I do think religion has its sets of beliefs, and I do think that a large part of philosophy goes against those sets of beliefs. But at the same time, I'm not completely sure if those are just two philosophical ideas, or if they are going against each other in the purpose of that question. But I would say, no, go on.
I say that they're a lot more intertwined than a lot of people really know. For example, Augustine of Hippo, an important theologian, is also known to have been very much a Christian Platonist. And the ideas of Plato and Aristotle became very important in Christian Europe, because Plato and Aristotle and the Platonists, in their ideas, were actually a lot closer to the Christians than they were to the polytheists of their time, which is actually why Socrates was killed. It was because he had viewpoints that were very different from the people around him. So in that way, Platonism survived as a field of study in Christianity for a long time. In addition to that, it was a lot of the religious institutions, such as monasteries, that really preserved, became the foundation of the current academic system. The current paradigm of people going to college and universities and all that sprang out of the religious institutions in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So a lot of these scholars and a lot of the scientists, especially early scientists, a lot of them were also monks or preachers and had other things. So at least from a historical perspective, there's not an opposition. Where the opposition arises is more on specific viewpoints, because most Christians don't object to, let's say, the Coanda effect various other ideas about the stratosphere and atmospheric science and various things. The points where they disagree are when it goes against a specific theological point. So Christians aren't necessarily anti-science. What they are is pro certain positions, or at least religious people are, and that leads to a large business of various religious people trying to look at alternative models to explain the same things, but in a way that is consistent with their theology. So there's actually a lot of people out there that are trying to do that.
Right, because I remember in the philosophy class I was mentioning to you just before we started the stream here was we were talking about some ideas, and one of those ideas was basically this question I asked you. And I remember the teacher was kind of talking about how he saw religion and philosophy more as like you were kind of describing the Venn diagram. I guess you could say it was kind of describing a Venn diagram as well, but he said that you had religion on one side and philosophy on the other, but the parts where they met in the middle, which would be the Venn diagram, I guess you would say, was the idea that they share the same thoughts. So I guess what he was kind of trying to say, and he said it a little bit better than I did there, but he was basically saying that although they are different because they serve different purposes, they're all trying to kind of say the same thing. So he was kind of describing that the way they go about explaining things is the same.
Cutting out.
I'm cutting out? Can you hear me now? Let's see what's going on here. You there? Let me try recalling him. Join call. I'm not even sure that worked. You there? Okay. I'm going to try calling again.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out for me. I missed part of what you said.
Okay. Where about did it cut out for you?
You were talking about where he was looking at the Venn diagram.
Right, okay. So what he was kind of saying was that although philosophy and religion were on both sides, and in the middle there were some parts that they both agreed with, was that although they're different because they're on either side, they're both trying to say the same thing using the same methods. So he was saying that because they use the same methods and they're kind of trying to say the same thing but going about it different ways, one for trying to explain something and the other to try to explain something for religion, well, they're basically the same thing because they go about it the same ways, was kind of the way I remember him explaining that question and answering the question. Basically, although they are different, they're more the same, was kind of the way he went about it.
Well, I guess he's trying to say that they're similar, but I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding of what philosophy is. Because philosophy, as a word, it's the love of wisdom. So it's not as if it's necessarily a mutually exclusive category that you can't be a philosopher and a theologian. I think the part of religion that worries about the deeper ideas, which is theology, is a type of philosophy. While let's say the religious components such as let's say, giving to charity. That's not a philosophical action, unless you're then giving a speech as to why it's important to give to charity. Then it becomes philosophical. But if you're just giving to charity as part of religion, that's not the same thing. So what I'm saying is that there are categories and that there exists a concrete overlap.
Right. That's why you were kind of explaining as a Venn diagram, which makes sense. Because the more I've kind of thought about the question through writing it, and I think it's always been a question I've thought about through the years, because especially in the education I got, it made me think a lot more about things in general. So the philosophy class I took was called TOK, which was Theory of Knowledge. And you had like your pillars of knowledge and your truths. And I'm going to look them up real quick because I kind of forgot which ones were which right now. But they basically represented different ideas, and you would have to prove points based on those ideas. So you had like your areas of knowledge, which were, if it's going to load, which it's not. But I want to say the areas of knowledge were like study. So you would have like science, so you had to prove it through science. Or you had to prove it through history. So you had to prove it through like one science type of study compared to something else. Yeah, here we go. The areas of knowledge were mathematics, natural science, human sciences, the arts, ethics, history, religious knowledge system, and indigenous knowledge system, or knowledge groups. So you had those areas of knowledge where you had to prove something with. So you would get like a prompt or a question. And just for the purpose of this example, we'll use the question we were talking about. And you would have to prove that through one of these areas of knowledge. And since it's talking about religion, you wouldn't be able to prove it through religion because obviously that's... Well, you could use religion as an example, but you would need one of the other ones to kind of fully demonstrate your point, I guess you would say. So like you would pick history, and you would have to prove it through history why they're more of the same or different. So that was kind of what I had to do in high school to prove something from a point.
I'm going to be fully honest here. I don't like that approach. That, at least the way you explain it, I don't like the approach that the class was taking. Because it doesn't seem to me like it's really trying to look into different kinds of epistemology, which is what I assumed they were trying to do, but rather that it's taking different fields of study and then conflating that with epistemology, which is not the same.
Right. Yeah, because I do think that in general, the class, you had to prove something through an area of study. I guess I think you even said that, but I think that's the best way of putting it, because like you had to make these presentations, and one of the presentations I made was about memory, and you had to prove what I was trying to say through memory, and in particular, I was picking false memory, which is basically what happens when you make up a belief that is so true in your mind that you believe it to actually have happened. And it happens a lot in like testimony cases for criminals, like in jury or not in jury, but in trial system, because somebody would believe they have seen that person because they saw him on TV or whatever it might have been, and made that belief that they were that person that saw them. And they believed it to be so true that it becomes part of their memory. So I remember making a presentation about that and having to use those fields of study or areas of knowledge as my backing for the presentation. And I think in general it was a good idea to kind of explain something to prove that it's a real idea through study and through things we generally believe to be true, like science and history. But I don't think it really understood the topic fully, because I think that there was a lot of philosophical ideas you could kind of think about with false memory and the implications it might have. More of just those areas of knowledge. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Because like, well, go on.
Well, as I think is important to note, because on the idea of false memory, there's people that, because some people have false memories, it means that people will have different memories, perhaps conflicting memories of the same event. Historians end up having different opinions as to what happened, and even in the sciences, there's a dozen different interpretations of quantum physics. So, yeah, it's a bit complicated in that way.
Yeah, because I remember in class, one of the students, or classmates, I guess you would say, brought up the question about how reliable is history really, because they were kind of talking about history as part of their presentation, and I'm forgetting exactly what topic they were talking about, but I think it had something to do with like Native Americans, and there was like 5 or 6 different stories about what actually happened. It may have been with like the Mayans or Indicas or a tribe like that, but either way, they were kind of discussing how there was so many different viewpoints to what happened to them, when in reality there is only one thing. But history is written by the victor, or history is written by the person whose the circumstances meet right. So in other words, like the person who was able to get their story believed the most, and that's what became history. And so history is very one-sided in that direction, because everybody has different viewpoints of events. Like you can take the same like family reunion or same Thanksgiving, and people are going to have different stories of what happened, although they were all at the same event. So that's kind of, although that is history, history is very one-sided in the fact that we only go on one story or one event, when that may not even be the exact thing what happened. So they were kind of discussing how history, although it was an area of knowledge in this case for TOK, how reliable really is it?
Especially when you consider how a lot of ancient histories, when you actually get into textual criticism, what you'll notice is that, let's say you look at the Gallic Wars. I've got a copy of that in Latin. Julius Caesar is believed to have written it by most historians. I can't think of any serious one that believes he didn't write it. But people generally believe that he may have altered the numbers in some respects. He may have perhaps over-represented the number of his enemies, or in some areas underrepresented his losses. And the earliest copies of the Gallic Wars are, the earliest manuscripts are found centuries after it was written. And that's something that needs to be taken account of as well. For example, in the writings of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian that became part of the household of the Flavian dynasty of Roman emperors, he wrote his history, and it is believed that some parts were perhaps tampered with in as they were delivered for history in the early Middle Ages. So that's very interesting to note, that sometimes even accounts that we know are contemporary can be modified after they were written.
Right, because I think, and this may not be the exact example of what you were saying, but just another example in general about how there's so many different stories about the same thing, is like the classic example I think of was like the game of telephone, where you'll start with like one word or maybe even a sentence if you're getting crazy, and you'll go around the circle until it gets back to the person just before the person who started, and they'll say what the incident was. In more ways than not, the answer was different than what got started. And that's just this example of communication. And I do think that a large part of ancient history was communication, and that's why there's a lot of different stories or ideas now where we look back and go, that probably didn't happen. Because I do think that some people in history, like the example you were using, wanted to make themselves seem more larger than they were, and for various reasons.
Yeah. A perfect example, or an example that many people agree on, is the inscriptions of ancient Mesopotamian monarchs who had religious reasons to always seem like they were victorious, and therefore, regardless of what happened and what wars they fought, they always claimed victory. And you can see that in the monuments that they erected for themselves. But then at the same time, you look at a different kingdom, and they said they won in the war. And then obviously somebody's got to be wrong. So...
yeah, one person was right. Or one group of people were right, yeah.
Not necessarily that one was right. They could have both been wrong.
Yeah,
That's also a possibility.
And I thought I would bring up the other examples. So you had like your areas of knowledge, and I was interested to see what you would think of the ways of knowing, or what they called WOK. And those were language, reason, sense perception, emotion, faith, intuition, and imagination. So those were what they were kind of believed to be your ways of knowledge. So I'm trying to think of the best way how to explain how you would use them. But essentially, you would have to prove your point through using mainly 2 or 3 of the examples of ways of knowledge, because not every one of them is going to have all of the ways of knowing. But I remember the teacher was very much against emotion as a way of knowledge, because he didn't really like that being in there, because he didn't think that emotion led to rational decisions, and it's supposed to be more like a rational idea. So I think the best way to kind of explain how you would use the ways of knowing was you would pick like an idea, like let's say you stop at stop signs, and you would have to prove that you're using Sorry? Can you hear me?
I guess not anymore.
Can you hear me now? Here, let me check something real quick. Alrighty. Let's see. Can you hear me? Looks like we're losing some audio connection here. Alrighty. Well, I think the chat can still hear me. So until I figured that out, I'll ask Ron or anyone else who might be in the stream if you had any questions for myself or... Okay, maybe I just need to turn it up a little bit more. Here we go. Can you hear me now? I think it's buffering.
And it stops. Then it starts. Then it stops. And I don't really know what will happen.
Yeah. I think it's buffering on the connection as far as what I can see from my end. You there?
I am here.
Alrighty. So, where did it cut out for you?
You were saying that he didn't like emotion.
Yeah, so he didn't like emotion to prove a point, Because as I was kind of saying, I don't know if you heard this part or not, but he didn't think that emotion led to rational decisions. And I'm trying to think of an example he exactly used, because it's a couple years ago now, and this wasn't a class I got introduced to philosophy for. So yes, I liked the class in general, but there was a large part of the class that I didn't like because I think it was trying to be too clever for its own good. And I don't think that it really was as brilliant as it thought it was.
Well, if he says that he doesn't like emotion because it doesn't lead to rational decision making, then isn't he implying, as a presupposition, that rationality has value, and that that value of rationality is greater than the value of emotion? So the question I would ask him is, why do you value rationality?
Right. Because I do. And I remember one of the students, because in general she was kind of against his thoughts overall, and I think she was a little quicker to kind of bounce on the idea of what he was trying to say. But she would always bring up the point that emotion was a large part of how decisions get made, because it's almost the body's intuition. Even though intuition was one there, it was almost the body's way of trying to feel something out. So she would kind of use an example of like a gut feeling, although that may be considered intuition. And he kind of, that's what he discussed. He was like, well, that's more intuition. But she's like, well, it's still an emotional feeling. So it's kind of a gray area on which one it counted as for that example. But in a large part, she would say was that emotion led to a lot of her decisions and the right decisions because of it. So she would kind of use an emotion of like fear if she thought someone was kind of watching her or following her, and she would make a decision to kind of get out of the situation. So that was kind of her example she used.
Cutting off for me again.
Let me.
Okay. I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's.
Well, my view on emotion and emotion and how it's used is because I view authority as being important. I think, therefore, that control is an outpouring of authority in a way. So, in my view, emotion is something that can be and something that should be controlled, in the sense that people should understand that there are appropriate uses for emotion. For example, you shouldn't be angry when there's no reason to be angry, or you shouldn't be sad when there's no reason to be sad. And I think that's the essence of the fullness of self-control, is to subdue your emotions and to exercise your authority over yourself in that essence, and that's self-control.
Yeah. Because, like, I don't know if you heard the example I was using when it was cutting out, but she would bring up the example of, like, motion bringing her base for making the decision. And she used the example of, like, fear, where she felt like someone was watching her or following her. She would get out of the situation, and that was purely an emotional decision, because she didn't really have a thought that someone was following her, but more of a feeling that that was the case.
Well, fear, in my view, is important. It's important because it is a type of fear. I don't think is something that is purely irrational, in the sense that I believe that fear has causes causes, and that brings you to a position that you are fearful for the right reasons. So, for example, danger is a cause for fear. The purpose of fear is an alertness to danger or to another form of threat. And fear is also important when you have a relationship to an authority, because if you break the law, then fear is something that helps you understand why you shouldn't break the law. For example, if you go and you try to rob someone, you might have a fear that someone might shoot you in self-defense, or that you might get arrested and go to prison. And I think that's a rational fear to have in that situation, and it helps you understand your relationship to the authority.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good example with using police for your authority point and the point of fear. And the teacher used a similar example from what I'm remembering, where he would bring up the point of a robbery and the fact that the robbers would watch out for certain things based on the fact that there's assumption, but he would more use the example of intuition instead of it being an emotional decision. He would say that it would be because of intuition that they knew that they could be gunned down or could be arrested by the police or other things relating to doing that as a crime. But his example was more intuition instead of emotion. And I don't think that it's solely one or the other, and it might be a little bit of both, but I generally agreed with the classmate of it being more of a emotional decision based on fear or based on any of the other emotions in that case.
Well, my idea is that rationality and emotion and intuition become complementary in someone that is controlled, that someone that has full self-control. They become complementary, because if you are angry for the right reason, then your anger helps you accomplish your goals. If you're fearful for the right reasons, then fear helps you accomplish your goals. If you're happy for the right reasons, then happiness helps you accomplish your goals. So in that sense, I think that they're complementary. You know what I'm saying? They work hand in hand and work together to accomplish things.
Right, yeah.
Synergism.
There's not just one or the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Synergy literally translates from Greek, working together.
Yeah, I think that there's like a case of the robbery that it is intuition and emotion that make that decision of the robber to be fearful of the potential to happen. And I don't think that one is over the other, although I do think that emotion may be the general charge, because I think when someone gets a lot of emotions over them, either being anger or happiness or sadness, they're fully and developed within that emotion. You hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? Maybe.
Hello?
You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. I think it just went back on. Yeah, I think it's a connection issue with the Wi-Fi I have here, and that's why it drops out occasionally. Anyway. So I don't think that one overwhelms the other, in kind of what I was saying with intuition and emotion. But I do think when someone is like fully in an emotion, that it can lead them to a decision purely based on emotion, such as like anger as an example for that. But I don't think that it's necessarily one or the other for most of the time. So I do think that I agree with your stance of it being more all in one than just one over the other.
Yeah. Well, what is the greatest commandment in Christianity?
Thou shalt not kill.
No, no, no.
Ah,
The
there's...
greatest commandment is thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind and with all your strength. That is the greatest commandment. And what you see here is you take all these different things, all these different capabilities that a human has, and they all work together for the same goal. And so you're actualizing the entirety of your being. So I think I'm linking it back to the theological concepts here. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So I thought we would get a little more, not that it has a little more of interesting type of questions or fun type of questions, I guess you could say, towards the end here. And I was asking a couple of people around Discord and my Twitter about type of questions I could ask you. And one of the questions was, how do you learn languages so fast? And do you think that language helps you and influences your beliefs and philosophy?
Okay, so I don't know where this is coming from because I don't remember telling anyone that I learn languages fast, but English is my third language, so I can see where people are coming from when they're asking that, and I also have some marginal knowledge on a number of other languages, but on the idea of learning languages fast, I think the fastest way to learn a language is immersion in it, in that you might move or live in a place where people speak the language. So it takes you out of the clinical environment of a classroom where everything is structured and actually puts you in a situation where in your daily life people are using it and you have a much stronger knowledge of the actual usage of the language. So what was the other part of the question?
Do you think that language influences your beliefs and philosophy?
I don't think that, well, actually, language as well as colors and shapes and types of government can actually affect your psychology in the sense that it can change the way that the tools you use to think about things. So if your language expresses ideas in a certain way, it can shape the way you form your ideas. Now, that being said, people have different ways of thinking. Some people think linguistically, some people think in images, some people think very emotionally, some people like to think in raw concepts. That's a lot less common, but I particularly like that type of thinking. But I will say that any type of thinking that is limited by one language can be expanded upon by learning a different language. So learning languages, even if it might not be practical because you might not have an opportunity to use the language, can be useful in putting forward ideas to you in new ways, especially if you're engaging in an idea that originates from a different linguistic context, such as, let's say, if we're talking theology, the Bible, it wasn't originally written in English. So knowing the original language of the text helps you really understand the context better in some ways.
Right. I like that as a viewpoint, because I was thinking I've never been to a foreign country besides Mexico, I believe, and that was several years ago. But I was thinking how you were kind of using government system as part of your example there. But in general, culture is very different, because I did learn French. Although I'm not super fluent in it, I can understand some sentences in France or in French. Like I'll take the example of if I generally hear a conversation, I'll be able to pick up on at least an intent of their conversation, but I might not be able to fully understand it. But even through the little language knowledge I have, I do think that it shapes your view a little differently than just knowing one language and just one way of thinking or one system. Because even through learning French, you kind of learn how their government works and how their culture is and just little different things within it. So it makes you think a little bit differently than just being narrow-minded with just one language. So I guess what I'm saying is I could see how learning multiple languages could help your beliefs in being more rounded instead of just one particular viewpoint.
Also, being an outsider to a language, not having grown up with it, can also be useful in different ways, because you have a different approach to how you use the language, and your approach to the language becomes more based on, let's say, the particular usefulness of the language as opposed to the necessity of the language, which is what you have when you grow up speaking a language. So it can lead to, in some cases, a greater type of eloquence.
Yeah. So I guess I would kind of want it to end, and I'll give you a chance to ask me a question if you had a question as well. So, or the chat, because I know some people are watching. So if the chat has any questions before we end the stream, they have a chance to ask as well. So if you had a question, you can go ahead. I think we cut out again. I think it froze. Fun. I'm going to try calling him again if it doesn't work. Okay, let's see. You there? Disconnect. Join the call. Let's see if this helps. You there? Alright, well. Hopefully I can figure out this audio thing a little bit better in the future, as we had some cutouts. I think it may be to do with the Wi-Fi, but I'm not completely certain.
Hello?
You there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we cut out again. Okay. Well, we'll see. Alright, so what I was kind of saying was, if you had any questions for me, you could go ahead and ask, since they largely been questions for you. If not, I would ask the chat if they had any questions, and if there's one before we end, we can answer their question as well. Did we drop again? You there?
Hello?
Yes, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Have to love technology when it works, but not when it doesn't work.
Okay.
I think it's just connection, but anyway, as it's been the entire time, hopefully. Anyway, what I was kind of saying was if you had any questions, you could go ahead and ask me as we kind of get towards the end here.
Okay. One thing, what do you think about coinism?
I've briefly looked into it going into this video, and I know that Stephen Ingramus had you on one of his episodes as well, and you kind of talked about it there a little bit. And I like the idea, but I don't know if I have a full opinion on it yet, because I haven't looked at it enough to really get an opinion from it. But from what I've looked in it so far, I would say that I like the idea. I don't know if I fully agree with it as a whole part. And I think maybe if you explain it on here a little bit, I might be able to understand a little bit more from the person itself, more than just kind of looking at it online and from other videos where I've kind of stumbled upon it.
Okay. So, did you want to ask me questions about that?
Well, I didn't really have any questions structured for it, so I guess if you just could explain it like in general what coinism is, that would work.
Okay. So, coinism is a political system and therefore a political ideology that I developed. It's not utopian, so the goal isn't to create a perfect society. The goal is to accomplish a number of political reforms in order to create a government that has a much reduced amount of corruption and is a lot more efficient, and also has a greater degree of liberty in a way by giving a lot of local authority to the local governments, so that in coinism what you have is that the local government, which is the government from local towns and communities, has pretty much almost the entire authority on social and economic issues, which means that different economic models and different social models can coexist in the same country without having to fight for dominance. And it also allows for experimentation in economic and social models in a limited framework, so that it can actually advance the development of these.
Right. Yeah. Because I don't think you'll ever reach a utopian society, as like, you have the famous novels of like George Orwell and others who've written kind of about utopias. But I do think I generally get the understanding of coinism. But I think maybe if you like the stream now, we could do one in the future where we kind of go over coinism as a whole topic in the whole stream. Because I do think that... No, go on.
In the meantime, I'm making posts on my blog explaining little bits and pieces of it, so that perhaps by the end of that, more information will be easily available for people to read, so that they don't have to speak to me directly or guess about what I'm talking about.
Right. And if you could post the blog channel on this Discord so I could put it in the channel description, I could, the others watching could... Oh, it's a website?
Coinism.com.
Oh, never mind. Coinism.com then. Yeah. So I think that... Yeah, okay. I think that would be a good idea in the future to do a stream just based on that. Because I know from the general times you've talked about it with other freedom scoopers, are from what I briefly found online, there's not too much information for it. So I do think that by reading your blog and maybe watching a little bit more videos, I'll be able to come up with some questions so that the audience members can understand it more and other things relating to it.
It's very important for me to have engagement with it because I don't claim to be a perfect person. So if I'm the only person that's involved in the development of this, then if I make a mistake and nobody's there checking my works, then I'll just be stupid. Okay?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's very important for the development of these ideas that other people interact with them, so that I can address questions people have on various elements, and it doesn't end up being something where it's really limited only to what one person is thinking.
Right. So yeah, I think that would be a good idea to do, and hopefully I'll be able to fix some of the connection problems and audio problems. I was thinking that we might have an audio issue because I thought I was able to figure it out, but Ron was saying that he could hear you through most of it, so hopefully I'll be able to get it through all of it eventually. I was hoping that wouldn't be a problem, but yeah. So I'll just give you a chance to kind of shout out your stuff. I know you just mentioned your blog, but you have a YouTube channel as well, and just give you a chance to kind of shout out those or anything else you wanted to mention.
Yeah, my YouTube channel, Anavultus, spelled the same as my username, which you know how to spell, so I'm sure that can be left up to you. And other than that, I've got my book, which is available for Amazon Kindle. So if you want, I can send you a link so that you can link that to people. It's actually very cheap. So because it's not a long book, I didn't want to charge heavily for it. But the reason I charge for it is because I actually want to make a living. So there you go.
Yeah, that's a pretty good reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you can link that as well, and I'll put it in the channel description once we're finished here. But I would just kind of shout out my stuff in general before we end. Obviously, I'm Roundtable Decision as you're listening here. I do have a Twitter at RoundtableIB and a Discord channel where at one point it was pretty popular, and I'm hoping to get it back up and have questions of the day. But I've been a little bit busy on other things and more video content so far. But I am going to have a Thursday live stream with my book series I've been doing about the novel and fantasy medieval book I've been making. So if you're interested in that, you can join me on Thursday. And the time is probably going to be around 2 Central, so 1 Eastern time, around that. I'm going to be doing that. I also have a few kind of philosophy and psychology type of videos I've been editing and making. And they're going to be probably all finished about at the same time. So I'll be able to kind of have some daily content probably next week. So that'll be really good as well. But those are kind of all the areas you can find me. And obviously you should check out Anavultus' channel if you're interested in what he's talked about here or philosophy in general. I've listened to a lot of his videos and really like them. And he has a podcast. Is the podcast regular schedule or? With Moorhead or Morfed?
Oh, the Anavultus and Moorhead? No, it used to be weekly, but he's very busy with the Quarantine Stories project. So it's usually depends on whether or not he contacts me. So it's not necessarily a regular thing, and it's not about philosophy either. So
yeah, no, I know it's not about philosophy, but it was. I listened to 2 of them, and one of them he wasn't on guest for, and it was a solo one as pretty much. But I like that content as well, so you should check that out if you're interested in that being not philosophical. But anyway, so that's kind of all we had here, and Ron just has a bunch of stickers. Unfortunately, it's not through D-Live, or it would be a sticker party, but I appreciate your effort, Ron. So yeah, if you had anything else to say, I'll give you last words. If not, we'll go ahead and end.
Thank you all for listening to what I have to say. Thank you for having me on. I'd just like to encourage people to wise up, to always try to examine your own views, to get the best views that you can possibly have. And that's it.
Alrighty, thank you, and thank you everyone who's watching either now or later, and hopefully we'll do it again.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I shouldn't have ended that. Oh well. Yeah. Thanks. Okay.